Hello, my name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of videos I'm taking a look at Karl Popper's article Science, Conjectures and Refutations, and we have arrived at sections 5 and 6, which will be the topic of this particular video. So in section 4, Popper introduced Hume and Hume's problem of induction, and he suggested that the solution to the problem of induction is to, first of all, agree with Hume that induction is always irrational, and second of all, to propose instead of an inductive procedure, a procedure of conjectures and refutations, of trial and error, where we come up with wild hypotheses and then subject them to criticism and try to refute them, and that's it. And the thing that I wanted to emphasize, and did emphasize in the previous video, is that at no point should we believe that Popper claims that we know these hypotheses, right? Or have positive evidence for these hypotheses, or think that these hypotheses are likely, or anything like that. Because all of that would involve induction, okay? And induction is irrational. It doesn't exist as a rational procedure. So, what happens in section 5? Well, in section 5, Popper is going to say a little bit more about this relation between observation and theory, and he is going to draw a link with Immanuel Kant and Kant's ideas about induction. Kant's ideas about causation, really, and about regularity, and about the mind imposing regularity on nature. Because that, in a sense, is what, according to Popper, we are doing, right? We come up with a theory, and we don't really sort of impose it on nature in the Kantian sense, in which nature is in a way dependent on the way that the human mind works. But we impose it on nature as an hypothesis, right? As something that, well, sometimes Popper uses the word expectation, but that is problematic, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But as a hypothesis that governs our research, and that we are then, of course, willing to reject as soon as we see something that doesn't fit the hypothesis. Now, that means that Popper thinks that unlike Hume's regress, right, because he criticized Hume for having the idea that repetition generates these inductive hypotheses, and Popper pointed out that you can't have repetition without already having such hypotheses, because we need some way to classify events as being similar or dissimilar. Popper is going to claim that there is no such regress in his own theory. So he writes, the problem, which comes first, the hypothesis or the observation, is soluble. The reply is an earlier kind of hypothesis. It is quite true that any particular hypothesis we choose will have been preceded by observations. The observations, for example, which it is designed to explain. But these observations in their turn presuppose the adoption of a frame of reference, a frame of expectations, a frame of theories. And so he says there is no danger here of an infinite regress. Going back to more and more primitive theories and myths, we shall in the end find unconscious, inborn expectations. So I said in the previous video that Popper opposes the empiricist idea of the tabula rasa, the mind as a blank slate. There are unconscious, inborn expectations. Again, I want to say more about that word expectations here in this context, but first, let's read the next little part. The theory of inborn ideas is absurd, I think. But every organism has inborn reactions and responses, and among them, responses adapted to impending events. These responses we may describe as, scare quote, expectations, without implying that these, scare quotes, expectations are conscious. The newborn baby expects, in this sense, to be fed, and one could even argue to be protected and loved. In view of the close relation between expectation and knowledge, we may even speak in a quite reasonable sense of inborn knowledge. This knowledge, however, is not valid a priori. An inborn expectation, no matter how strong and specific, may be mistaken. Okay, So suppose that somebody says that a newborn infant, a baby, expects to be fed. That maybe it knows that it will be fed. I guess there is a sense of those terms in which we might agree with that, right? The newborn infant is hungry, starts crying, and in some sense we may say that the baby expects that crying will lead to it being fed. In some sense. I mean, this is clearly not the core sense of expectation. This is clearly not the core sense of knowledge or belief. If we, in this way, attribute beliefs, expectations, knowledge to a newborn infant, it is merely by analogy, right? It is merely because we recognize some of the features of full-blooded, sort of real-life adult expectations and beliefs and knowledge in this situation of the infant. So, not saying that we couldn't use those words here, but Popper is quite right to put them between scare quotes and talk about expectations and inborn knowledge between scare quotes. Or he would be quite right if he were talking in a normal context, in sort of any context except the context of his own philosophy. Because what has Popper been telling us? He has been telling us that induction is irrational. He has been telling us that no idea about the future can be knowledge, that in fact it is impossible to have rational beliefs about the future. So clearly nothing, not even in the adult case, can count as knowledge about the future. I would go as far as to say that, well, certainly if we see that Popper is right, we also can no longer have beliefs about the future. Right? If I know that it is irrational to believe that something will happen in the future, then I'm not going to have any beliefs about the future anymore. And so I'm not going to have any expectations anymore. At the very least, for somebody whose eyes have been opened by Popper's own story about induction, expectations about the future don't exist. Right? All that I have are bald conjectures, which are there to be refuted, but I don't believe those conjectures. I don't expect that they will be true. So in the full-blooded sense, right, the sense of somebody who really has knowledge, well, there is no knowledge about the future and there are no expectations about the future. And so Popper is walking a very slippery slope here. Right? He is introducing terms like expectation and knowledge about the future, which really don't have a place in his own philosophy. Right? Insofar as there are expectations about the future, they are only there to be unmasked by his own analysis of induction as irrationalities, right? As not not something that we should have, as something that we should give up as soon as we understand what's going on. And so there is something incredibly dubious in Popper's attempt to push forward the baby with its innate expectation to be fed as sort of the first step on the road to scientific theories. Because clearly the baby is not entertaining "I will be fed" as some, random hypothesis which we boldly conjecture and the purpose of which is to be refuted. Right? Nothing like that is going on. There is no analogy between the situation of the baby and the situation of the full-blown theoretic scientist who knows that Popper's criticism of induction is right. And so Popper should be incredibly careful to avoid at every point in his article talk about expectations and knowledge of the future, but he is not very careful to avoid that. And again, I want us to keep this very clearly in mind, because not keeping that clearly in mind, and the way that Popper writes makes it very easy for us not to keep that clearly in mind, is going to confuse for us two radically different positions. Popper's claim that induction is irrational, and a sort of very moderate claim that almost everyone would agree with, that, we are never certain about our theories, but we test them, and this increases our knowledge. That can't be Popper's view, because that is an inductivist view, right? So Popper's view, what Popper ought to be doing, is avoiding any positive talk about expectations or any suggestion that we can have knowledge about the future. Okay. Not saying that Popper is making a mistake here, and I'm also not saying that he's sort of doing this on purpose to make things unclear for us, but I do think that there is a tendency in Popper's writings here and maybe in general to say things that are true on one interpretation in his own philosophy and on a very different interpretation in the sort of common sense view of science, which leads many of his readers to mistake in the end what is going on in these texts and whether we should agree with them or not. Okay, so having said that, let's move on. What Popper is going to claim is that we are born with expectations, which, although not valid a priori, right, they might turn out to be wrong, we have to empirically test them, they are psychologically or genetically a priori. We are born with them. And in fact, he goes on, they are even logically a priori. We need them before we can do any research. Right? So we need to have these kinds of inborn expectations before research can even get started. Okay, now we get to Kant. That this all corresponds very closely to the law of causality, which Kant believed to be part of our mental outfit and to be a priori valid. One might thus be inclined to say that Kant failed to distinguish between psychologically a priori ways of thinking or responding and a priori valid beliefs. So one of the first lines of the Critique of Pure Reason is a line where Kant makes a distinction between knowledge, all knowledge being based on experience and all knowledge starting with experience, which is precisely the distinction between a priori validity and a priori sort of ways of thinking, psychologically a priori ways of thinking. So this is a bit strange for Popper to say, but okay, it is in fact not his real analysis of Kant, because his mistake was not quite as crude as that. Kant was mistaken, but not that crudely. For the expectation of finding regularities is not only psychologically a priori, but also logically a priori. It is logically prior to all observational experience, for it is prior to any recognition of similarities, as we have seen, and all observation involves the recognition of similarities. But in spite of being logically a priori in this sense, the expectation is not valid a priori, for it may fail. We can easily construct an environment, it would be a lethal one, which, compared with our ordinary environment, is so chaotic that we completely fail to find regularities. This is not a very good Kant interpretation. So, first of all, Kant never, I'm going to make a sort of footnote with that in a moment, but Kant never gives us any specific regularity and says, oh, this regularity is known a priori. Not that Popper is saying that, but I want to make this clear. So Kant never tells us that sort of the regularity that the sun will come up every morning or anything like that is valid a priori. Right? That's not what we're saying. Okay, so what is valid a priori? Well, Popper talks in a footnote, so that's footnote 15, about Kant believing that Newton's laws of motion were a priori, because he would have said so in his Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. I'm not certain that is a correct interpretation of the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, but I'm going to set it aside anyway, because the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science is really not sort of the core part of Kant's philosophy here. Right? What we're interested in when we think about Kant's claims about a priori knowledge, what we are generally interested in and thinking of primarily are the claims made in the Critique of Pure Reason. So even if we suppose that in the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, Kant says that Newtonian physics is known a priori, even then, maybe that's wrong. Sort of the core part of Kant's philosophy, the Critique of Pure Reason, still stands. So what is it that Kant says in the Critique of Pure Reason? Well, one of the things that he says a bunch of things, like that every experience is going to be in space and time, or every experience is going to be in time and outer experience is going to be in space, where outer means experience of something that's not part of me. He's going to tell that all our experience involves substance, and that all our experience, and this is what Popper is primarily interested in, falls under the laws of causation. So every experience falls under some causal regularity. Okay, that is important, right? Kant's claim is that every experience must fall under some causal regularity. That is the a priori knowledge, not which regularities those are. Right? So Kant doesn't really say anything about which regularities we're going to find. Okay, now Popper is actually not really wrong about that here, because he says that, his example is going to be an example of something that where we completely fail to find any regularities. Right? So Popper is suggesting that we can imagine an environment in which there would be no regularities whatsoever to be found, and so we, as subjects, would be completely overwhelmed by chaotic experience. Well, here's what Kant would say. There is no such thing as chaotic experience, because chaotic experience is not experience. The idea of a subject implies the idea of regularity. Something can only be a subject, well, thing is not really the right word, but when we think through the nature of the subject, then the identity of the subject, right? Different experiences belonging to the same subject requires, according to Kant, that all those experiences are experiences of the same orderly, law-governed world. In the same way, for a bunch of experiences to be experiences of the same world requires for them to be unified in a single unified subject. So, for Kant, the idea of a subject in a world that is so chaotic that there's no such thing as lawhood, that there's no such thing as a recognizable regularity, simply doesn't make any sense. There would be no subject there and there would be no object there. Okay, if we really want to understand that, we would have to delve a lot further into Kant. And if you do want to delve a lot further into Kant, well, I happen to have an entire series of lectures on the critique of pure reason. But let's leave it at that for the moment. Popper's thought experiment presupposes a law-governed world and a subject studying that law-governed world, namely us building up an experimental situation where some unlucky subject gets completely chaotic experience. Well, Kant would say, look, the very thinkability of this thought experiment, the very conceivability of this thought experiment requires the idea of a subject in a law-governed world, right? And now, within this framework of a subject and a law-governed world, Popper is postulating a new subject, a second subject, who does not have regular experiences, but in fact, Kant would say, there's no subject there, and there are no experiences there. If it's really total chaos, then nothing that might be it's very sad, but if you take a baby and you put that baby into an environment that is literally completely chaotic, then there actually is, that baby cannot come to constitute a subject. That's just not going on. That's just impossible. And so Popper, you don't have to agree with Kant, but one thing that I think is completely clear is that Popper totally misrepresents Kant's philosophy here. Right? This has nothing to do with Kant's philosophy. This thought experiment is absolutely in no way an argument against Kant's view. And therefore, it doesn't really tell us whether Kant's view about induction can solve Hume's problem. Right? That is just something that Popper never even starts to come to grips with here. All right, that is what I wanted to say about Popper and Kant. Let's take a brief look at section 6, which is very short and not too much happens there. In section 6, Popper makes a distinction between, on the one hand, dogmatic thinking and on the other hand, critical thinking, the dogmatic attitude and the critical attitude, and kind of suggests that we sort of need both. Right? We need to start with these expectations, And then we need to criticize them and generate sort of new expectations and criticize them again. And he gives us some sort of psychological theorizing about how dogmatic thinkers get into being, what kind of childhood trauma might lead to dogmatic thinking, and so on and so forth. Okay, section 6 is not so important. Section 7 and section 8 are going to, and 9 and 10, I mean, now we're going to return to the unfolding of Popper's theory. So I hope to see you again in our next video.